I was still warm from another woman's bed when his wife walked through the door holding a pregnancy test. Kang Minjai didn't hear Amara come in. I was standing at the wet bar in the living room, shirt half buttoned, Sophia's perfume still caught in the fabric, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey like it was any ordinary morning. Then he turned around. Amara was standing 6 feet away, holding a small white stick, her eyes bright with something he hadn't seen in months. Hope. Real, unguarded hope. She was still in her coat. She hadn't even taken off her shoes. She looked at him the way she used to, before everything. And Minjae felt the whiskey glass go cold in his hand. If you have ever loved someone and known, in one single moment, that you were about to destroy them, then you already understand what happened next. If you haven't, stay with me, because this story is going to show you exactly what it costs when a man chooses power over the people who matter most. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way through. I promise you, every part of this is worth it. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that morning, because nothing was ever the same after it. Amara Bennett Kong had been awake since 4 in the morning, not because the baby was coming. She was only 9 weeks along and hadn't told a soul yet. Not her mother in Atlanta, not her closest friend Naomi, not anyone. She had been awake because she'd taken the test at 3:47 a.m., sitting on the cold tile floor of the master bathroom with the door locked, her back against the cabinet under the sink, waiting for 2 minutes to feel like 2 years. When the second line appeared, she sat there for a long time without moving. She wasn't sure what she felt first. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was something older and more complicated than joy. The kind of feeling that comes when something you wanted so badly finally arrives at a moment that isn't quite right, and you're not sure yet whether it's a blessing or a warning. Minjae had not been home the night before. He hadn't been home the night before that either. He always had a reason. An operation that ran late, a negotiation that couldn't wait, associates from Tokyo who needed FaceTime over dinner and drinks. Amara had stopped asking for details a long time ago, and she told herself that was maturity. That was the compromise a woman makes when she marries a man whose world is larger and more dangerous than anything she grew up around in Atlanta. She told herself that a lot of things. She had been a pediatric physician in Atlanta before she met Minjae at a medical conference in Seoul 3 years ago. She was presenting a paper on neonatal care outcomes. He was there in a suit that cost more than her monthly salary, attending for reasons she later understood had nothing to do with medicine. He had walked up to her during the cocktail reception and said, very directly, that he had read her paper and found 2 methodological errors, and then smiled. Like that was a perfectly normal way to introduce himself. She had told him he was wrong about one of them. He had looked at her like no one had ever done that before. They were married 14 months later. She had left her practice, her apartment, her entire life in Atlanta and moved to Seoul, which she had learned to love with the specific stubbornness of a woman who refuses to regret her choices. She had built a life here. She had friends. She had a language she was still learning. She had a husband who, in the early years, had made her feel like the only fixed point in a world that was always moving. Then the world kept moving, and she stopped being fixed in it. She got off the floor at around 5:30, washed her face, and made a decision. She was going to tell him. Today. That morning. However he came home in whatever state he was in, she was going to sit him down and put the test in his hands and watch his face. And she was going to let herself believe, for just a little longer, that the man she married was still in there somewhere. She put on coffee. She sat at the kitchen island. She waited. Minjae came through the door at 7:12 a.m. She heard the elevator before she heard him, the soft mechanical hum of it ascending to their floor, then the short silence before the doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer. She heard him set something down. She heard him exhale. She picked up the test from the counter where she'd set it and walked into the living room. He was at the wet bar, shirt not fully buttoned, hair still slightly damp from what she assumed was a shower taken somewhere that wasn't here. He was pouring whiskey at 7 in the morning, which he did sometimes after a long night, and he had his back to her, and for a moment she stood there watching him and thought about all the versions of this conversation she'd rehearsed in her head since 3:47 a.m. Then he turned around and saw her. She held up the test. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They had talked about children. They had tried, quietly, for almost a year. She had not known how much she wanted it, until the months of trying became a kind of grief she carried around without telling him. Min-jae looked at the test. Then he looked at her face. He said, "Amara." "We're pregnant," she said. Her voice was steady. She had worked hard to make it steady. 9 weeks. I took the test this morning. He didn't move for a moment. The whiskey glass stayed in his hand, halfway to the bar. His face did something complicated. She saw it. She was a physician. She was trained to read faces. A sequence of emotions crossing through him so fast she couldn't catch them all. Something that looked like genuine shock. Something that looked almost like fear. And then, just underneath that, something she couldn't name. 9 weeks, he repeated. Yes. He set the glass down. He ran a hand through his hair. He crossed the room toward her, and she felt her heart do something embarrassing. It lifted. She hated that it lifted. She hated how much she still wanted him to close the distance between them and be the man she needed him to be. He put his hand on her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone. He looked at her for a long moment. How are you feeling?" "I'm okay," she said. "I wanted to tell you in person." "Of course." He nodded slowly. His hand dropped from her face, and she felt the absence of it like a small door closing. This is good news, Amara." She watched him say it. She was a doctor. She knew the difference between a man who meant something and a man who was managing a situation. She smiled anyway, because she wanted to believe the good version of this story. What she didn't know, what she would not find out for another 6 weeks, was that when Min-jae excused himself to take a call in his office 20 minutes later, the call was from Sophia Vale. And the first thing he said to Sophia was not that his wife was pregnant, or that he needed time to think, or that things between them needed to stop. The first thing he said was, "I can't talk right now." And then, "I'll come by tonight." Amara spent the rest of that morning alone in the apartment, eating crackers because her stomach was already sensitive, Googling OBGYNs in Seoul who accepted international patients, making a small list of names she liked. She didn't know any of this yet. She was sitting at the kitchen island writing down names, and she was, for a few hours, genuinely happy. That afternoon, Min-jae sent her flowers. She put them in a vase and took a photo and sent it to her mother in Atlanta with the caption, "Good day." She wasn't ready to share the news yet, but she wanted to hold the feeling close to something real. She didn't tell her mother that she had stood in the living room that morning and watched her husband's face and felt, underneath the relief, a small, cold space that she couldn't explain. She didn't tell her mother that when he touched her face, she'd noticed the smell. Faint, almost buried under his cologne, but there. Something warm and sweet. Not her perfume, not anything she owned. She noticed. She filed it away. She made herself a cup of tea and went back to her list of names. That was the thing about Amara Bennett Kong. People underestimated her capacity for stillness. She had grown up the middle daughter of a woman who taught her that patience was not the same as passivity, that watching carefully was not the same as doing nothing. She had carried that lesson through medical school and residency and the particular brutality of a neonatal ICU, where you learn to hold your feelings at a distance from your decisions, because both your feelings and your decisions had to remain functional at the same time. She was watching now. She had been watching for months. But this morning she had wanted to stop watching. She had wanted to just be a woman who was pregnant and scared and hopeful, telling her husband, waiting to see his face open with something real. He'd given her almost that. Almost. Almost was the word she kept coming back to. 6 weeks later, the almost became something she couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was smaller than that. It was a Thursday night when Min-jae came home late and she was already in bed, not asleep, just lying there in the dark. And she heard him in the bathroom and then heard him brush his teeth and come to bed. And in the dark, she turned toward him and he turned away from her in a way that was automatic. Not cruel, just absent, the reflex of a man whose mind was already somewhere else. And she lay there in the dark with 16 weeks of pregnancy in her body and thought, something is wrong and has been wrong for a long time, and I have been choosing not to see it. She started the next morning, not dramatically, not with confrontation or accusations, because she was not that kind of woman, and she understood Min-jae well enough to know that confrontation would only push him into a position where he had to defend himself, and then she would never get the truth. She started with what she knew. She started with what she could find. The first thing she noticed was the calendar. Min-jae ran his legitimate businesses out of an office in Gangnam, and the criminal operations through a network of intermediaries she had never asked him to explain. He had always been careful about keeping her at a safe distance from that part of his life, and she had let him, and she had told herself that was love. But now she started looking at patterns. When he said he was working late, what did his driver's log say? When he said he was in Tokyo, what did his credit card statements show? She was a methodical person. She had always been methodical. She found the first gap within a week. A Tuesday in March, when Min-jae had told her he was flying to Busan for a meeting, she remembered the specific night because she had been having Braxton Hicks contractions that scared her, and she'd called him and gotten his voicemail and texted him and waited 2 hours for a callback, but his credit card had been used at a restaurant in Seoul's Itaewon district at 8 p.m. that same night. Dinner for two at a place she didn't recognize. A place that, when she looked it up, had tablecloths and candlelight and a wine list. She sat with that for a week before she did anything else. Then she called a private investigator. A woman named Park Ji-soo, who had been recommended by someone in Amara's language class, described only as discreet and very good. Amara met her in a cafe near Gyeongbokgung Palace on a Wednesday afternoon when Min-jae thought she was at a prenatal yoga class, and she sat down across from a small, quiet woman with very sharp eyes and explained what she needed. Park Ji-soo listened without writing anything down. When Amara finished, the investigator said, "What do you want to do with what I find?" "I don't know yet," Amara said honestly. "I need to know the truth first." "Most people say that," Park Ji-soo said. "Not all of them mean it." "I mean it," Amara said. The investigator looked at her for a moment. "Okay," she said. "I'll be in touch." Amara went home, ate dinner alone, and told herself she was doing the right thing. She was 23 weeks pregnant. Her son, she knew now it was a son, was moving inside her with increasing frequency and confidence, small jabs against her ribs that she loved fiercely. She put her hand on her stomach on the subway ride home and felt him move and thought, "Whatever I find, I will protect you. That is the one thing I am certain of." Park Ji-soo came back to her within 10 days. The file she delivered was not dramatic. It was just paper, photographs, timestamps, a list of locations and dates. It was the kind of evidence that was difficult to argue with because it was not emotional. It was administrative. It was the bureaucratic record of a man living two lives. Sophia Vale. Min-jae's business partner in 3 of his legitimate ventures. A woman Amara had met at company dinners and smiled at and had no particular feelings about one way or another. 41 weeks of documented contact, hotel records, a security camera still from a parking garage in Mapogu, a series of phone records showing call frequency and duration that told a story all by themselves. Amara sat alone at the kitchen table with the file in front of her and her son moving against her ribs, and she did not cry. She thought about crying. She considered it the way you consider an exit door, as a thing that exists that you're aware of, that you might need at some point but not right now. Not now. Her hands were very still on the table. Her face was very still. She breathed in and out and looked at the photographs and allowed herself to understand fully, without softening it, what she was looking at. Then she picked up her phone and called Elijah Cross in New York. Elijah was her cousin's college roommate, now a family attorney with 20 years of practice and a specialty in high-asset divorce cases involving complex financial structures. She had not spoken to him in 2 years. He answered on the second ring. Amara, he said, warm and immediate, like time hadn't passed. "How are you?" "I'm going to need your help," she said. "I need to understand what my rights are. I need to know how to protect myself and my son from a man who has more resources than I know how to count." There was a brief silence. She heard Elijah exhale. "Tell me everything," he said. She told him. She told him about the organization, what she knew of it, which was more than Min-jae would have been comfortable with. She told him about the financial structures, the shell companies whose documents she had photographed quietly over 6 months of careful access. She told him about Sophia. She told him about the night she had contractions and couldn't reach her husband. She told him about the USB drive she had begun building, piece by piece, for exactly this reason, because she had always known, in the quiet part of herself that she never let speak too loudly, that this day might come. Elijah listened. Then he said, "You're smarter than he thinks you are." "Most people are," Amara said. We're going to need three things, he said. Documentation, a network he can't touch, and time. I have all three, she said. Then we're going to be okay, Elijah said. But Amara, once we start, there's no soft version of this. You understand that? She looked down at her son pressing against her ribs. I understand, she said. She started building the exit the day their son was born. Hanjae came into the world 6 weeks early, small and furious and perfect, with a NICU team surrounding him within minutes of delivery. Amara lay in the hospital bed afterward, exhausted in a way that went past physical, and Min-jae sat in the chair beside her and held her hand, and she let him, because he was the father of her child, and she was not yet ready to stop hoping. He held Hanjae that first day with a care she had not expected. She watched his face above the small bundle of their son and saw something real there, something that was not managed or calculated. It lasted about 3 days. Then the calls started again. The late returns. The absences. Hanjae spent 11 days in the NICU with a respiratory condition that resolved itself slowly, incrementally, in the way that such things do. 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The particular cruelty of neonatal medicine that Amara understood professionally and experienced personally as a different kind of suffering entirely. She spent most of those 11 days in a chair beside the incubator. Minji came when he could, which was not as often as she needed him to come, and each time he left she watched his shoulders straighten as he walked out the door, the physical relief of a man returning to a world that made sense to him. She did not say anything, she just watched. And when Hanjae came home, healthy and small and impossibly loud, Amara began the final stage of her preparation. She contacted Victoria Ellis, whose organization she had found through Naomi. She finalized the documents with Elijah. She transferred resources quietly. She built the black envelope that would sit in the nursery drawer for 6 weeks before the morning she finally used it. The morning of Min-jae's return, she did not sleep at all. She stood in the nursery for the last time at 4 a.m. and held her son and told him quietly, in the dark, "Your father is not a bad man. He is a man who made choices, and now I am making mine." Then she packed the last bag, called the car she had arranged 2 weeks earlier, and walked out of the penthouse with Hanjae in her arms, while the city was still dark, and her hands were completely steady. She left the black envelope on the nursery floor, and she did not look back. When Min-jae came through the door at 7:12 a.m. and walked to the wet bar and poured his whiskey and turned around to find the apartment completely silent in a way it had never been silent before. No sleeping sounds from the nursery, no coffee smell, no Amara. He stood very still for a moment. Then he walked to the nursery, the empty crib, the envelope on the floor. He picked it up. His hands, for the first time in as long as he could remember, were not steady. He read the note. "By the time you see this, our son and I will already be safe. You will not find us. My attorney will contact you." He read it twice. Then he sat down on the floor of the empty nursery in his half-buttoned shirt that still carried the ghost of Sophia's perfume, and he held a piece of paper that was the most honest thing anyone had ever said to him. And Kang Min-jae, the silent dragon, the man without weakness, sat alone in the room where his son had slept and did not move for a very long time. He sat on the floor of the empty nursery for 41 minutes. Min-jae knew the exact number because at some point his body registered the cold coming up through the hardwood, and his mind, trained by decades of operational discipline to track time even when everything else was falling apart, counted the minutes the way it counted everything, automatically, without mercy. 41 minutes. He didn't move, didn't make calls, didn't do the thing he would have done in any other crisis, which was stand up, button his shirt, and start issuing orders. He just sat there with the envelope in his lap and his back against the wall beneath the window and looked at the empty crib. It was a good crib. He had picked it out himself, one of the few things he had done personally in the preparation for Hanjae's arrival. Italian craftsmanship, solid walnut. He remembered standing in the showroom in Cheongdam-dong, thinking about his own childhood, the narrow bed in a narrow room in a part of Seoul that no longer existed, and he had pointed at the most substantial thing in the room and said, "That one," because he had wanted his son to have something solid, something that would hold. The crib was still there. His son was not. He got up at 7:53 a.m. and walked to his office and opened the USB drive. He watched it all, every file, every photograph, every document. He sat in his chair with the expression of a man receiving a medical diagnosis, very still, very controlled, processing information with the part of his brain that did not feel things yet, so that the part that did could be held in reserve for later. It took him 3 hours. When he finished, he closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the silence of his office and thought about the specific quality of Amara's patience. 6 months of documentation. 8 months, if you counted the financial records. She had been sitting across from him at dinner, sleeping in the same bed, letting him put his hand on her face the morning she told him about the pregnancy, letting him touch her, letting him manage the moment, while carrying all of this inside her, while building this file, while preparing to walk out a door she had been quietly locating for almost a year. He had spent 20 years reading people, assessing threats, identifying the precise moment when loyalty became liability and acting before the other person could. She had done it to him. He picked up his phone and called his head of operations, a man named Ryu Sung-wook, who had been with him for 11 years and whose primary qualification was that he solved problems without being asked twice. Ryu answered immediately. "Sir." "She left this morning," Min-jae said. "My wife and my son. I need them found." A beat of silence. Not long. Ryu was not a man who took long beats, but present. "Understood. Do you have any indication of direction?" "No, she covered it well." He paused. "Start with international travel. She has American citizenship. She may try to move Hanjae out of the country. I'll flag the airports within the hour. Credit cards are already frozen on my end. Do the same for any accounts connected to her name." Another pause. Slightly longer this time. "Sir, there may be accounts we don't have visibility on." "I know," Min-jae said. "Find them." He hung up and called his attorney, a man named Oh Dae-jin, who charged fees that would make most people's vision blur and who earned them. Oh Dae-jin answered on the first ring, which meant he had already been expecting the call, which meant someone had already told him, which meant Min-jae's world was already reacting to the morning before he had finished processing it himself. "I heard," Oh Dae-jin said without preamble. "I'm sorry, Min-jae." "Don't," Min-jae said. "What are my options?" "Legally? It depends on what she files first and where she files it. If she attempts to establish jurisdiction in the United States, she has a Korean marriage certificate. Hanjae was born here. That helps us. But if she moves fast enough and gets a sympathetic court, stop telling me what she can do and tell me what I can do." Oh Dae-jin was quiet for a moment. "You need to file for custody here in Korea before she establishes jurisdiction anywhere else. Today, if possible." "Then do it today." "Min-jae?" The attorney's voice shifted. Careful now. Measured. "The filing will work. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Ask." "Is there anything in those documents she has, anything she might present to a court, that would complicate our position?" The silence that followed was the most honest thing Min-jae had produced in months. "Handle it," he said finally. "Whatever she has, find a way to handle it." Oh Dae-jin exhaled through his nose. "I'll start the filing, but Min-jae, I need full disclosure, all of it. I cannot represent you effectively if I'm walking into a courtroom and getting surprised." "You'll have what you need." He hung up before Oh Dae-jin could ask anything else. The first 48 hours were operational. Min-jae moved through them the way he moved through any complex deployment, decisively, without sleeping, burning through information and action and leaving no space for the thing underneath, to surface. Ryu's team flagged 17 possible exits from the country. All dead ends. Amara had not used her own name on any travel documents, which told Min-jae two things. She had resources he hadn't accounted for, and she had been planning this with a level of sophistication that required professional help. He started looking at her contacts. He found Naomi Carter within 6 hours. Dr. Naomi Carter, child development specialist based in New York, who had visited Seoul twice in the past 8 months, once 6 weeks after Hanjae's birth. He found Victoria Ellis within 12, the director of a private family protection organization whose public profile was deliberately minimal, the kind of minimal that takes effort to maintain. And he found Elijah Cross within 18 hours, which was when his stomach turned to something cold, because Elijah Cross was not just a family attorney. Elijah Cross specialized in high-asset cases involving defendants with organized crime affiliations. He had built a career on knowing exactly what men like Kang Min-jae were capable of. She built a team, Min-jae said. He was standing in his operations room, which occupied the back half of an office building in Mapogu that appeared from the outside to be an import consulting firm. Ryu was across the table from him. Two other men were at workstations in the corner. The air smelled like stale coffee and cigarettes. A very good team, Ryu said carefully. Don't editorialize, Min-jae said. Just tell me what we can do. Cross is in New York. We have contacts there, but his office is... I'm not threatening her attorney, Min-jae said. His voice was flat. Don't suggest that again. Ryu's expression didn't change. Then our options are primarily legal, pressure through the Korean courts, the international custody framework. And if she's in the United States, there are reciprocal agreements. She knows about the reciprocal agreements. Min-jae sat down. She's been 3 moves ahead of me since March. Maybe longer. I need to stop thinking about what she's done and start thinking about what she needs. Ryu waited. She doesn't want money, Min-jae said, more to himself than to Ryu. She had access to money. If money was what she wanted, she could have taken it 6 months ago and been gone. She wants something else. What? Min-jae didn't answer that. He was looking at the table surface, at the grain of the wood, at some middle distance between himself and a conclusion he wasn't ready to reach yet. On the 3rd day, Sophia called. He was in his car, being driven back from a meeting with Oh Dae-jin's office, and her name appeared on the screen of the secondary phone, the one Amara hadn't known about until 6 months ago, and now clearly did. He looked at the screen for 3 rings. He answered. I saw the news, Sophia said. There was a careful quality to her voice, something measured that she was working to maintain. People are talking, Min-jae. You're people. I wanted to... Where are you? He said. At my office. Why? Stay there. He hung up. He arrived at her office 20 minutes later. She was standing at the window when he came in, wearing the kind of composed expression that he recognized as effort rather than calm. And she turned when she heard the door and something moved through her face. Relief first, then something more complicated. I heard she left, Sophia said. You heard, he repeated. Min-jae. How long have people known? His voice was very quiet, very still. The stillness that Ryu and every other person who worked for him understood as more dangerous than volume. About you and me. How long have people in my organization known? Sophia's jaw tightened. I don't know what you're asking. Yes, you do. She held his look for a moment. Sophia Vale was not a weak woman. That was, he recognized now, part of why this had happened, because she was sharp and strong and moved through his world with a fluency that Amara had never been designed for, and he had confused that fluency for compatibility. He had made a profound mistake. He saw it clearly now, with the particular clarity of a man standing in the wreckage of his choices. Some people suspected, she said finally. I can't control what people suspect. Did you know she was collecting evidence? Of course not. Did anyone warn you? Did anyone in my network approach you about her asking questions or... No. Sophia stepped toward him. Min-jae, stop. She's gone. She took your son and she's gone. And I understand what that means to you. But you need to focus on what comes next, what's legally possible, what comes next, he said slowly, is that I understand what this cost me. Something in Sophia's face shifted. She went very still. I'm not angry at you, he said. He said it quietly, and he meant it, and it was somehow worse than anger. I chose this. Every part of this, I chose. But I need you to understand something right now clearly, so there's no confusion between us. What? This is over, he said. Whatever this was, it's over. Sophia held the stillness for another moment. Then she turned back to the window. I know, she said. He left without touching her. He got back in the car and looked at the city moving past the windows and felt the full weight of the last 3 days land on him at once. Not the operational failure, not the strategic miscalculation, but the specific grief of a man who understands he built something real and destroyed it with his own hands before he understood its value. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He did not cry. He was not, at that point, capable of crying. But something in his chest moved, the way old structures move when the ground beneath them shifts. Slow, deep, final. On the 5th day, the message arrived. It came through a channel that should not have been accessible to anyone outside his inner network, a secure communication platform used exclusively by his organization's senior lieutenants. The message was 2 lines, sent from an address that traced back to a series of anonymized routing nodes that his best technical people spent 3 hours trying to unravel before giving up. Not everything taken from your home was delivered to your wife's attorney. Some information was given to me. You know what it means. I'll be in touch. It was signed RM. Min-jae read the message 4 times. He did not say anything. He handed the phone to Ryu, who read it and looked up with an expression that Min-jae had seen on Ryu's face exactly twice before in 11 years. The expression of a man who is genuinely uncertain about what he is looking at. "Who is RM?" Ryu said. "I don't know." "But the document reference Ryu's voice dropped. "If this is the financial operation from the Daejin holding account, I know what it is," Min-jae said. Ryu was quiet for a moment. "If someone outside our network has that specific documentation, they can take down everything," Min-jae said. "The legitimate businesses, the operations, the holding structures, everything." "Who had access to those files besides us?" "No one," Min-jae said. "No one should have had access." He stood up and walked to the window of the operations room and looked at the street below. The ordinary afternoon of a city that had no idea what was moving through it, and thought about Amara, about the months she had spent in his apartment, moving through his life with her physician's patience and her methodical mind, photographing documents she should not have been able to access. He had underestimated the scope of what she took. "She didn't hand everything to Cross," he said. "She gave some of it to this RM person as insurance, in case I came after her legally, in case I tried to use my resources to suppress the custody proceedings." He turned back to Ryu. "She built a failsafe." "Then she's more than 3 moves ahead," Ryu said. "She's been thinking about this longer than I thought." Min-jae's voice was quiet. Not defeated, not yet, but carrying the sound of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew. "She didn't do this impulsively. This took planning, months of planning, maybe more." He thought about the morning she told him about the pregnancy, the white stick in her hand, the steadiness of her voice, the way she watched his face. She had been watching him for a long time. She had been deciding. "Find RM," he told Ryu. "I'll start immediately. But if the routing—" "I don't care about the routing. Find the person. Use whatever it takes." Ryu nodded and left the room. Min-jae stayed at the window. Outside, the afternoon was the color of old bone, pale and flat and indifferent. He thought about the nursery, the solid walnut crib he had chosen because he wanted his son to have something that would hold. He thought about Amara at 4 in the morning on the bathroom floor, taking a test alone. He thought about the 11 days in the NICU when Han-jae was fighting through something fragile and uncertain, and how he had come when he could, which was not often enough, and left when the walls of that room started pressing on him, and how every time he walked out he had told himself he was doing what was necessary, managing his empire, keeping the machine running so his family would have what they needed. He thought about what they had actually needed. He was still standing there when Oh Dae-jin called back. "Min-jae," the attorney said, "the custody filing is prepared, but I need to tell you something before we submit it." "Tell me." "I've been in contact with Cross's office. Preliminary communication, standard protocol." A pause. He was very professional, courteous. "But he told me something that I think you need to hear." "What?" He said, and I'm quoting, "My client is not seeking to remove the father from her son's life. She is seeking to protect them both from the consequences of his choices." Oh Dae-jin paused. "I was very specific about that. Not to remove you, to protect them from consequences." Min-jae didn't respond immediately. "That's not what this looks like in her documentation," Oh Dae-jin continued carefully. "The financial records she has. If she wanted to destroy you, Min-jae, she could do it. Cross could walk into any courtroom in 3 countries with what she apparently holds and make your life very difficult. The fact that she's not leading with that, she's using it as a shield," Min-jae said, "not a weapon." "That's my read, yes. Which means—" Oh Dae-jin stopped. "Which means what?" Min-jae said, though he already knew. "Which means she's not trying to take your son away from you. She's trying to make sure you can't take hers." The phone call ended. Min-jae stood in the operations room for a long moment. Then he walked out, got in his car, told his driver to take him home, and rode the elevator up to the penthouse alone. He walked through the apartment, through the living room where she had stood with the test in her hand 9 months ago, through the kitchen where she had made coffee in the early mornings, through the hallway where Hanjae's photographs were still on the wall, and went to the nursery. He sat down on the floor again. Same wall, same cold hardwood. He picked up the black envelope, which he had left exactly where he found it, and took out the handwritten note. He read it for the 6th time. By the time you see this, our son and I will already be safe. You will not find us. My attorney will contact you. He looked at the empty crib for a long time. Then his phone buzzed with a message from Ryu. RM identified. You need to see this in person. Min-jae looked at the message. Then he looked at the crib. Then he stood up and straightened his jacket and walked back toward the door, because there was still a part of him. The part that had built an empire from nothing, the part that had never in his adult life accepted a situation he could not control, that believed the answer to this was somewhere ahead of him, in some confrontation or negotiation or strategic move he hadn't yet made. He was, in that moment, still the wrong version of himself. But something was beginning to crack. He just didn't know it yet when Ryu's second message arrived 40 seconds later, 3 words that made him stop in the doorway of the empty nursery with his hand on the frame. RM works for you. 3 words. Min-jae read them twice, standing in the doorway of the empty nursery with his hand still on the frame, the wood solid and cold under his palm. RM works for you. He called Ryu before the second reading was finished. Talk, he said. I need you here. Ryu's voice had the quality of a man who had spent 20 minutes deciding how to have a conversation and still hadn't found a good way into it. In person, not on the phone. Who is it? Min-jae. Tell me the name. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to confirm what Min-jae already suspected, that the name was going to require a room, a chair, and several minutes of controlled silence to process without doing something irreversible. Lee Dong-hyun, Ryu said. Min-jae took his hand off the doorframe. Lee Dong-hyun, 34 years old, 8 years inside the organization. Currently holding the position of financial liaison between the legitimate Daejin holdings and 3 of the subsidiary operations, a position that required by its nature access to exactly the kind of documentation Amara had somehow obtained and passed to an anonymous third party. Lee Dong-hyun, who had sat at Min-jae's table, who had eaten at his company dinners, who had 14 months ago been the man Min-jae personally vouched for when 2 of the senior lieutenants questioned whether someone so young should have access to the holding account structures. I vouched for him, Min-jae said. Yes, Ryu said. I put him in that position. Yes. Min-jae looked at the empty crib from the doorway. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. In the silence, the apartment made the small sounds of an empty apartment, the refrigerator cycling, the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below, the particular quality of air in a space that used to contain people and now didn't. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Min-jae said. He was there in 15. The operations room was quieter than usual when he arrived. The 2 men who were normally at the workstations in the corner had been cleared out. Ryu was standing at the far end of the table, and in a chair at the near end, with his wrists not bound but his phone removed, and 2 of Min-jae's people standing behind him with the specific posture of men who were there to prevent exits rather than participate in conversations, sat Lee Dong-hyun. He was younger looking than his age in the way that some men are. Lean face, careful eyes, the kind of person who you looked at and your first instinct was to assign him a supporting role rather than a lead. Min-jae had noticed that quality when he hired him and had read it, incorrectly, as harmlessness. Lee Dong-hyun looked up when Min-jae walked in. His expression was the interesting part. Not the fear that Min-jae expected, or not only fear. There was something else underneath it. Something that looked, uncomfortably, like a man who had been waiting for this conversation and had made his peace with it. Min-jae pulled out the chair at the opposite end of the table and sat down. He didn't look at Ryu. He looked at Lee Dong-hyun. How long? Min-jae said. Lee Dong-hyun's jaw moved slightly. How long what? Don't, Min-jae said quietly. I have a very specific kind of patience right now, and I need you to understand that wasting it will go worse for you than just answering the question. How long have you been in contact with my wife? A beat. 7 months. Min-jae breathed in, breathed out. She approached you? She asked questions at first, Lee Dong-hyun said. At the Daejin end-of-year function, she was asking about the holding structures, framed it as curiosity, like she was trying to understand the business her husband was in. I told her basic things. Nothing sensitive. And then? And then she came back. He paused. About a month later. She knew what questions to ask by then. She wasn't curious anymore. She was specific. She was building a file, Min-jae said. Yes. And you helped her. Lee Dong-hyun looked at him steadily. Yes. The room was very quiet. One of the men behind Lee Dong-hyun shifted his weight. Ryu didn't move. Why? Min-jae said. It was a simple question, monosyllabic, but it carried more weight than anything else he'd said since walking in, because it was the first question in this entire crisis that wasn't strategic. It wasn't operational. It was personal, and everyone in the room felt the difference. Lee Dong-hyun seemed to feel it too. Something in his posture changed, not softening exactly, but settling, like a man putting down something he'd been carrying at arm's length. Because I have a daughter, Lee Dong-hyun said. She's 3. And when Dr. Kang, when your wife came to me the second time and told me what was happening in that apartment, what wasn't happening, what her son was being born into, he stopped, recalibrated. She wasn't asking me to betray you for money. She wasn't threatening me. She just told me the truth about what she needed and why, and I made a decision. You made a decision, Min-jae repeated, to help a woman protect her child. Yes. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. It had texture, weight. Min-jae looked at Lee Dong-hyun for a long moment. The careful eyes, the lean face, the specific quality of a man who had committed to a position and was not going to walk it back regardless of what it cost him. He understood that quality. He had built his entire organization on being able to identify it. What did you give RM? Min-jae said. Specifically, the Daejin holding account transfer records from March through August, the shell company registration documents from the Cayman structures, and the correspondence between your attorney and the private banking contact in Singapore. Lee Dong-hyun held his gaze. The correspondence that establishes knowledge of insider positioning in the Hana construction bid. The air in the room went thin. Ryu made a sound, not quite a word, just a sharp exhale through his nose that meant he understood exactly what he was hearing. The Hana construction bid, a government infrastructure project worth 400 billion won. A bid that Min-jae's legitimate construction subsidiary had won 14 months ago on the basis of, officially, a superior proposal. Unofficially, on the basis of advanced knowledge of a competitor's pricing structure obtained through a contact inside the procurement committee. The kind of thing that, in Korea's current political climate, with its aggressive anti-corruption enforcement posture, could generate criminal exposure that had nothing to do with his underground operations. The kind of thing that could be prosecuted cleanly, in public, in a courtroom, with documents. That documentation, Min-jae said carefully, if it reaches the wrong people. It already reached someone, Lee Dong-hyun said. That's what the RM message was telling you. It's been passed. It exists somewhere outside your control. What happens with it from here depends on what you do next. Min-jae stood up. He walked to the window of the operations room, the same window he'd stood at 2 days ago, looking at the ordinary afternoon, and put both hands on the glass and looked at the street below and thought about what he was actually dealing with. Not a runaway wife, not a custody dispute, not even a blackmail threat exactly. A structure. A carefully constructed architecture of consequence that Amara and Cross and Victoria Ellis and apparently Lee Dong-hyun had built around him like a cage he hadn't seen until he was already inside it. Every exit he might have taken was already accounted for. Every resource he might have deployed had been anticipated. The financial pressure, the legal pressure, the organizational exposure. Each element designed not to destroy him, but to prevent him from doing what he would have done instinctively. Fight, suppress, control. She had taken away his ability to fight and left him only one option. He just wasn't ready to see it yet. Get him out of here, Min-jae said without turning around. He meant Lee Dong-hyun, and his voice was flat and contained the specific blankness of a man who has set aside his immediate response to a situation for processing later when he's alone. He's done. Clear his access and terminate his contract, but he leaves here intact. He heard movement behind him, the sound of the door, Ryu's footsteps crossing the room. "Min-jae?" Ryu said carefully. "Not now." The Hana exposure. I said not now. He felt Ryu stop moving, felt the room hold itself. He kept his hands on the glass and his eyes on the street below and breathed in slowly through his nose. "Give me 10 minutes. He heard Ryu leave. He stood at the window alone for 8 of the 10 minutes, just breathing. Not thinking, or not thinking in the tactical sense, letting something move through him that he'd been holding at arm's length since 7:53 in the morning 6 days ago, when he got up off the nursery floor and started making calls. A feeling without a clean name, too large to be grief, too specific to be rage, something that felt like recognition, like being shown, very precisely and without cruelty, exactly who he had become. He had 2 crises now. The custody proceedings, which were moving through legal channels in New York, and which Cross was managing with the efficiency of a man who had done this before with much more dangerous defendants. And the Hana exposure, which lived in the hands of someone called RM, who might be a hostile actor, a third-party operator, or, Min-jae's gut told him, someone else entirely. Someone connected to Amara's network who was holding the documentation not to use it, but to make sure Min-jae knew it existed. Insurance. She had built insurance into her insurance. He called Ode Jin. "The Hana documents," he said when the attorney answered. "Someone outside our network has them." 3 seconds of silence. "How many documents?" "Enough?" Min-jae. Ode Jin's voice dropped to something that was barely above a murmur, which meant he was in an office where someone might hear him, and the fact that he felt the need to lower his voice told Min-jae that his attorney had already been thinking about this exposure, that it was not news to him that it existed, only news that it had moved. If that documentation reaches the prosecutor's office, or if it gets into the hands of a journalist, "I know what it means," Min-jae said. "What I need to know is whether there's a way to contain it." "Legally?" A pause. "Not if it's already been passed to a third party. Once it's outside our control. I'm not asking about legally." Silence. "Min-jae." Ode Jin's voice was very careful now. "I need you to hear what I'm about to say clearly. Say it. If you move against whoever holds that documentation in any extra-legal way, and that becomes known, and right now with your wife's attorneys watching every move your organization makes, it will become known. It will be the end. Not the end of the custody case, the end of everything, the legitimate businesses, the holding structures, you personally." A pause. "They have been waiting for exactly that. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Min-jae understood. He hung up and stood very still in the empty operations room for a moment, his phone in his hand, and felt the architecture of his situation close around him with the slow mechanical precision of a vault door. He could not fight the custody proceedings without revealing his own criminal exposure. He could not move against the RM documentation without confirming the kind of man he was. He could not access resources without triggering financial scrutiny. He could not pressure Amara without every action being documented and weaponized. Every door Kang Min-jae had ever used to solve a problem had been identified, cataloged, and locked from the outside, by a woman he had thought was too quiet to fight back. He went back to the penthouse. He didn't know why exactly. There was nothing left there that was useful. But he went back, and he walked through the apartment again and ended up in the nursery again, standing over the walnut crib in the dark because it was late now, past midnight, and he hadn't eaten anything since morning, and his body was beginning to register the particular trembling exhaustion of a man running on adrenaline and refusal. He picked up his phone and looked at Han-jae's contact in his phone. Amara had set it up in the early weeks after the birth. Han-jae, home, with a small photo of the baby's face that Min-jae had not taken himself, but had been sent by Amara one afternoon when he was in a meeting and had looked at quickly and put his phone face down on the table. He looked at the photo now. His son's face. 7 weeks old in the photo. The dark eyes that were his own eyes in miniature. The slight furrow of the brow that Amara said was pure Kang. The mouth that was hers. A face that was made of both of them, which was a fact that carried, standing alone in a dark nursery at midnight, more weight than he was fully equipped to hold. He didn't call. There was nothing to say that would matter over a phone call, and he was not sure Amara would answer. Instead, he sat down on the floor again. 3rd time. Same wall. He thought about Lee Dong-hyun's face. "I have a daughter," She's 3. The man had put his entire career and his safety inside this organization on the line because a woman he barely knew had told him the truth about what she needed, and he had believed her. Min-jae had spent 2 decades building loyalty through fear and incentive and careful management of consequence. Lee Dong-hyun had walked away from all of that because of a conversation. He thought about what that said about the kind of man he had become, that the loyalty built on truth had defeated the loyalty built on power. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number, different from the RM channel. A new point of contact. The message was brief, and it was not from RM. My client would like to arrange a preliminary conversation. Not a negotiation, not a confrontation, a conversation. If you're willing to listen, she is willing to speak. One condition, you come alone. No attorneys, no organization present. We will provide the location. Min-jae read the message 3 times. Then he typed back, when? The reply was immediate, tomorrow, 7 a.m. She's been awake since 4. He stared at that last sentence for a long time. She's been awake since 4. It was the kind of detail that a lawyer wouldn't include. It was the kind of detail that came from the person herself, from Amara, sitting somewhere he couldn't find her, awake at 4 in the morning the way she had been awake at 4, the morning she took the test, the morning everything began. It was the kind of detail that was not tactical information. It was human information. It was her way of telling him that she was not made of stone either, that this was costing her something too. He typed back, I'll be there. He did not sleep. At 5:30 in the morning, an hour and a half before the meeting, he was sitting at the kitchen island where Amara used to eat breakfast alone on the mornings he didn't come home, and he was looking at the surface of the counter, and he was doing something that felt unfamiliar and effortful and necessary, which was trying to think about himself clearly. Not strategically, not operationally, clearly. What he saw was not comfortable. A man who had chosen, repeatedly and with full awareness, to prioritize his own world over his family. Who had built the logic of necessity around every absence. The organization needed him. The operations required his presence. The empire didn't run itself. And had used that logic so consistently that he had eventually stopped noticing it was a choice. Who had sat in a hospital room watching his son fight for breath in an incubator and felt the walls pressing and left, because leaving was the thing he was best at. Who had stood in this kitchen and poured whiskey at 7 in the morning while his wife watched from 6 feet away, already decided, already gone in every way that mattered, waiting to see if he would give her one reason to stay. He had given her flowers. He thought about flowers. At 6:55, he got in his car alone. No driver. No Ryu. No security. He drove to the address that arrived on his phone at 6:45, a small meeting room on the 2nd floor of a private family law office in Mapogu, the kind of space that existed specifically for conversations that needed to happen without the weight of institutional architecture around them. He parked on the street, sat in the car for 30 seconds, walked inside. The room was quiet. A table. 4 chairs. A window that looked onto the street. On one side of the table sat a woman he didn't know. Mid-40s, composed. The specific composure of someone who had managed many rooms like this one. Victoria Ellis, he realized. The director. The woman who had helped Amara disappear. And sitting across from her, in the chair closest to the window, with Han-jae asleep against her chest in a soft carrier that Min-jae had never seen before. Amara. She looked up when he walked in. She looked tired. Not broken. He had half expected broken and found instead something much harder to manage, which was a woman who had been through something difficult and come out the other side of it still standing. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were still on Han-jae's back. She was wearing clothes he didn't recognize from some new life she had already begun without him. She looked at him the way you look at a person you have known completely. Every flaw, every grace, every version of them, and have loved and survived. She did not smile. She said, "Sit down, Min-jae." And the man who had controlled an empire, who had never in his adult life been told to sit down and done it, pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Because his son was sleeping against her chest, and the sound of Han-jae's breath in that quiet room was the only sound that mattered. And Kang Min-jae, for the first time in 20 years, had no move left to make except to listen. "I'm not here to negotiate," Amara said. Her voice was even, controlled. But underneath it, he was close enough now to hear it. There was something that cost her. I'm here because there is something I need you to understand before the legal proceedings move forward, and because she paused, looked down at Hanjae's sleeping face, looked back up. Because you deserve to hear it from me directly before you hear it from attorneys. Min-jae said nothing. His eyes moved to his son and stayed there. The RM documentation, Amara said, is not going to prosecutors. It's not going to journalists. It was never meant to destroy you. She held his gaze. It exists so that you cannot use your resources to destroy us. That's all it was ever for. I understand that now, Min-jae said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. It took me longer than it should have. Something moved through Amara's face. Not softening, something more complicated. The specific expression of a woman who has been right about something and takes no pleasure in it. The custody agreement my attorneys are preparing, she said, gives you visitation, real visitation, not supervised forever, not conditional on humiliation, but conditional on one thing. What thing? He said. She looked at him across the table, in the quiet room with their son breathing between them. That you decide, she said, whether you want to be Hanjae's father, not the silent dragon, not the heir of anything, his father. She paused. Because I am not going to raise our son to be afraid of the man who made him. Min-jae looked at his son's face above the carrier, the dark eyes that were his, the brow that furrowed in sleep exactly the way his own did. A face that had been fighting since 11 days before he was supposed to arrive in the world, small and furious and determined, which was, Min-jae thought, the most honest thing that had ever come from him. He felt something move in his chest. Not the shifting of old structures this time. Something breaking open. Victoria Ellis watched from across the table and said nothing. And Min-jae, who had walked into this room still carrying the wreckage of the man he had been, understood in that moment what the cage Amara had built around him was actually for. Not to punish him. To give him the only exit that had ever been worth taking. He just had to be willing to walk through it without his armor on. He looked up from his son's face. He looked at Amara. And he said the only true thing he'd said in longer than he could account for. I don't know how to be that man yet. I know, Amara said. Her voice was very quiet. That's why I'm still here telling you it's possible. He drove home alone. No radio, no calls. Just the city sliding past the windows in the early morning gray, the streets still thin with traffic, the Han River visible for a moment between buildings before it disappeared behind concrete and glass. He drove the way a man drives when his hands know the route and his mind is somewhere else entirely. Automatic, functional, absent. He got back to the penthouse at 8:43. He sat in the parking garage for 11 minutes before getting out of the car. The conversation with Amara had lasted 40 minutes total. Victoria Ellis had said almost nothing for most of it, which was the particular skill of a woman who understood that the most important conversations required witnesses, not participants. Amara had said what she came to say. Min-jae had said almost nothing in return, which was not silence from strategy. The old silence, the managed silence of a man controlling a room. But something different. The silence of a man who has run out of the language he built his life in and hasn't yet found the language that comes next. Before he left, he had asked one question. Can I see him? His eyes on Hanjae, still sleeping against Amara's chest. Just for a minute. Amara had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had reached up and unclipped the carrier and carefully, the specific care of a woman who had spent months learning the weight and temperature of a particular sleeping person, transferred Hanjae into Min-jae's arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake. Min-jae had stood there holding his son for 90 seconds. He counted them the way he counted everything. He looked at Hanjae's face. He felt the weight of him, heavier than he remembered from the last time he had held him, 3 weeks ago in the penthouse. A quick exchange in the hallway when Min-jae was leaving for a meeting and had stopped for 30 seconds because Amara was holding the baby in the light from the kitchen window, and something about the image made him stop. 30 seconds then, 90 now. He handed Hanjae back carefully. He did not look at Amara's face when he did it. He walked out. Now he sat in the parking garage and pressed his back against the seat and stared at the concrete ceiling and let himself, for the first time in 8 days, not do anything, not plan, not assess, not manage. Just sit with what the morning had shown him. He had walked in there with some residual idea. He recognized it now, clearly, the way you recognize something in daylight that confused you in the dark. That the meeting would be another negotiation. That there would be leverage points he hadn't identified yet. That Amara, face to face, would show him some crack in the structure she had built that he could use. There was no crack. What there was instead was his son's face and his wife's steady eyes, and a sentence that he was still turning over. I am not going to raise our son to be afraid of the man who made him. He got out of the car. He took the elevator up. He called Ryu from the hallway. I need a meeting, he said. Full senior council. Everyone. Tonight. There are a few things you should know before that, Ryu said. The careful quality was back, the particular caution of a man delivering information he knows will shift the coordinates of the conversation. 2 things came in this morning while you were out. Tell me. Odejin received a formal communication from Cross's office. The custody filing is moving faster than we anticipated. They're requesting a preliminary hearing before a Korean family court within the next 10 days. They've already established that Dr. Kang, that Amara has maintained Korean residency documentation, which strengthens their jurisdictional argument. And the second thing? A longer pause this time. We received a communication from someone identifying themselves as a representative of Commissioner Park's office. Min-jae stopped walking. Commissioner Park Sung-il, the head of the Financial Intelligence Unit attached to the prosecutor's office. A man whose name, in Min-jae's world, was the equivalent of a weather system. You tracked his movements the way you tracked pressure fronts, because when he moved toward you, the damage was a matter of when, not whether. What did they want? Min-jae said. To arrange a meeting, Ryu said. They were very polite about it. They said the commissioner had some questions about the Daejin Holdings and the Hana Construction subsidiary. Min-jae stood in the hallway of his penthouse floor and looked at the door to his apartment and breathed in slowly through his nose and thought about the architecture of the situation, which had, in the space of one morning, become something different from what it was before. The RM documentation had moved, not to a journalist, not to Cross's office, to Commissioner Park Sung-il's office, which was worse than both options combined, because Park was not a man who made moves without already knowing the outcome. He did not arrange polite preliminary meetings unless he had already decided what the meeting was for. When? Min-jae said. They suggested Thursday. Today was Tuesday. Tell them Wednesday, Min-jae said. 8 a.m., my attorney's office. He hung up, went inside, stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hands on the counter and his head down and breathed. Then he called Odejin. Park's office contacted us, Odejin said before Min-jae could speak. I know, I was about to call you. What's his position? I spoke with his senior deputy for 20 minutes this morning. Odejin's voice was doing the thing it did when the news was genuinely bad, which was become very precise, very measured, each word placed carefully, like a man walking on ice. They are not, and I want to be very clear about the distinction, they are not opening a formal investigation. Yet, a bid that they describe as preliminary intelligence requiring clarification. They want to know if I'll cooperate, Min-jae said. They want to know if you're going to make this easy or difficult, Odejin said. And Min-jae, I have been doing this for 23 years. I have sat across from Park Sung-il's office in 3 separate matters. I need you to understand something. Say it. If they have what I think they have, and if you attempt to obstruct, suppress, or fight this through any extra-legal means, they will open a full investigation and they will pursue it with everything they have. But if you come in Wednesday and you are cooperative, genuinely cooperative, full disclosure, willing to discuss restructuring and compliance, he paused. There is a possibility, not a guarantee, but a possibility, of a negotiated resolution that does not end with you in a courtroom. Cooperation means giving them the organization, Min-jae said. It means giving them the parts that are already exposed, Odejin said. It means getting ahead of what they have before they use it as a foundation for what they can build. And the operations. The underground operations, Odejin said carefully, are outside my expertise and outside what I can advise you on with a straight face. What I can tell you is that the legitimate business structures, the ones connected to the Hana exposure, are what Park's office cares about. The rest is... He stopped. The rest is a separate problem. It's not a separate problem, Min-jae said. It's the same problem. I know, Odejin said. But Wednesday, you deal with the piece in front of you. Min-jae hung up. He did not eat, did not sleep. He went to his office in the penthouse, the room where he had opened the USB drive 8 days ago, and watched Amara's case against him unfold like a legal document that was also, somehow, a mirror. And he sat at his desk and pulled out a legal pad and started writing. Not strategy, not counterargument, and accounting. He wrote down every operational structure connected to the Daejin Holdings. Every shell company, every financial relationship, every transaction that had a legitimate surface and an illegitimate interior. He wrote it all out in longhand, in his own handwriting, because writing it by hand forced him to move slowly, and because moving slowly forced him to actually look at each thing he was writing. It took 4 hours. When he finished, he had 11 pages of tightly written notes that represented, in aggregate, the full architecture of the financial machine he had spent 20 years building. He looked at it spread across his desk and felt something he hadn't expected to feel, which was a kind of relief. Not happiness, not resolution, but the specific relief of a man who has been lying to himself for a long time and finally stopped. He had built this believing he was building security. For himself, for his people, eventually for his family. The logic had seemed sound when he was 26 and fighting his way into a landscape that ate people who weren't willing to be harder than the people around them. The logic had calcified into habit, and the habit had calcified into identity, and somewhere along the way, he had stopped being a man who made hard choices out of necessity and become a man who made hard choices because that was simply what he was. He looked at the pages. Then he called Ryu. The senior council meeting tonight, he said. I need to change the agenda. To what? Ryu said. To a conversation about transition, Min-jae said. About what happens to the organization's legitimate operations when they move under new leadership. The silence on Ryu's end lasted long enough that Min-jae could hear him breathing. You're stepping back, Ryu said finally. It wasn't a question. I'm stepping back, Min-jae confirmed. How far? Far enough to survive what's coming without taking everyone else down with me, Min-jae said. Set the meeting for 9 p.m. The senior council met in a private room of a restaurant in Gangnam that the organization had owned for 7 years through a third-party holding. There were 6 men around the table, not counting Min-jae and Ryu, and Min-jae had known all of them for at least a decade. He had built relationships with each of them through the specific language of his world, through reliability and consequence, and the understanding that his word, once given, held. He sat at the head of the table and told them everything, not everything in the legal pad sense, not the full accounting, but everything relevant to what was coming, the Hana exposure, Park's office, the documentation that was already in the hands of people he couldn't reach. He told them in the flat, specific language he used for operational briefings, without softening it or managing it, because these men had spent years around him and would recognize management from 50 feet and trust it less than the raw version. The room was very quiet while he talked. When he finished, a man named Cho Byung-soo, the oldest of the 6, 61 years old, who had known Min-jae since Min-jae was a 22-year-old nobody trying to prove he was worth the risk, leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then looked back at Min-jae. You're telling us this is controlled demolition, Cho said. You knock down the parts that are already compromised before they fall on the rest of us. Yes, Min-jae said, and the underground operations. Continue under existing leadership. I will not be operationally involved. He paused. But I will not cooperate with investigators on anything related to those operations. That is the line I will hold. Cho looked at him for a long time. What does Park's office actually have? The Hana documents, the Singapore correspondence, the Cayman shell registrations. Nothing on the operations themselves. Nothing on the operations. Cho nodded slowly. Then you can give them the legitimate side and keep the rest intact. He looked around the table. That's survivable. It costs him half the empire, another man said. Younger. Harder jaw. Name of Shin Kyung-tae, who had been with the organization for 6 years, and who Min-jae had always privately assessed as the kind of man who confused ambition with capability. It costs me the parts that were already gone, Min-jae said. The question is whether I walk out the other side, or whether I let the whole structure come down trying to hold on to something I can't hold. Shin Kyung-tae looked at him across the table. Something moved in his face. Not quite respect, not quite challenge. Something in between. And after Wednesday, Shin said, what does that look like for you? I focus on what's left, Min-jae said. I focus on my son. The table was quiet. Cho picked up his glass, looked at it, set it back down. Do the rest of you have questions? He said to the table. No one spoke. Cho nodded. Then we're done. Min-jae left the restaurant at 11:47 p.m. He went back to the penthouse. He slept for 4 hours. Not restful sleep, the heavy dreamless sleep of a body that has exceeded its capacity and shut down without permission, and woke at 4 in the morning. He lay in the dark of the bedroom that was now only his bedroom and thought about Amara being awake at 4. He got up. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen island and prepared for Wednesday. Wednesday morning arrived with the specific weight of mornings that you have been dreading. Min-jae was at Oh Dae-jin's office by 7:30. The attorney met him in the conference room with 2 associates, a stack of files, and an expression of controlled professional focus that Min-jae recognized as Oh Dae-jin's version of bracing. Walk me through your position one more time, Oh Dae-jin said. Full cooperation on the Hana bid and the related financial structures, Min-jae said. Complete disclosure on the Singapore correspondence and the Cayman holdings. Willingness to discuss restructuring and compliance frameworks going forward. And your position on criminal liability for the Hana bid itself? I'll accept a fine and a suspension of the construction subsidiary's bidding rights. I will not accept personal criminal charges. Oh Dae-jin looked at him. You understand that's an opening position. They may push for more. Then we negotiate, Min-jae said. But that's where I start. And if they have more documentation than we think they have? Then we deal with what's in front of us, Min-jae said. Oh Dae-jin studied him for a moment. You're calmer than I expected, he said. I'm not calm, Min-jae said. I'm out of other options. Park Sung-il's representatives arrived at 8:03. 2 of them, a senior deputy named Han Ji-young, mid-40s, with the specific posture of a government attorney who has spent 2 decades being underestimated by men in expensive suits and learned to use it as an advantage, and a younger associate who spent the first 15 minutes of the meeting saying nothing and watching everyone in the room with the focused attention of someone whose job was observation. Han Ji-young set a thin folder on the conference table and folded her hands on top of it. Thank you for meeting us, she said. Her tone was professional and entirely without warmth. Commissioner Park asked me to convey that the purpose of this meeting is preliminary. We are here to understand your client's position on a series of transactions, not to make formal determinations. We understand, Oh Dae-jin said. Han Ji-young looked at Min-jae directly. Mr. Kang, the documents we have received relate to the procurement process for the Hana infrastructure project, specifically the advanced pricing intelligence obtained in March of last year. Can you tell me your understanding of how that intelligence was acquired? Min-jae looked at her steadily. It was obtained through a contact inside the procurement committee. I was aware of the source at the time of acquisition. Oh Dae-jin, to his credit, showed nothing on his face. He had advised against this level of direct admission in the preliminary meeting. Min-jae had overruled him this morning. Han Ji-young's expression shifted by approximately 2 millimeters. A slight recalibration, the look of a person who walked in expecting to extract information through several hours of careful questioning and has just had it handed to them in the first 5 minutes. You were personally aware, she said. Yes. And the decision to use that intelligence to inform the bid was mine, Min-jae said. The younger associate wrote something down. Han Ji-young looked at Min-jae for a moment with the expression of a person reassessing the room. Mr. Kang, I want to be direct with you. The Commissioner's office is prepared to discuss a negotiated resolution to the Hana matter that would avoid formal criminal prosecution in exchange for full disclosure and structural compliance commitments. However, that conversation requires complete cooperation on the financial documentation. Define complete, Oh Dae-jin said. All transactions connected to the Dae-jin holdings for the past 5 years, all subsidiary relationships, full disclosure of the offshore structures. Han Ji-young paused. And we will require your client's testimony on the procurement committee contact. We need the name. Min-jae looked at the folder on the table. The contact inside the procurement committee was a man named Baek Jun-seok, 63 years old, 30 years in government service, 3 grandchildren. Min-jae had known him for 8 years. Not a friend exactly. The relationships that produced this kind of arrangement were never friendships. But a man who had been useful and who had been compensated fairly and who had, as far as Min-jae knew, spent those years managing his exposure the way careful people did. If Min-jae gave his name, Baek Jun-seok's career ended. His pension, possibly. His freedom, depending on what else Park's office found when they looked. This was the part Oh Dae-jin had warned him would come. "I need a reset," Oh Dae-jin said smoothly. 20 minutes. Han Ji-young nodded. She and her associate stood, picked up the folder and moved to the hallway. The door closed. Oh Dae-jin turned to Min-jae immediately. "You gave the direct admission without any conditions," he said. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge in it. I know what you advised. Min-jae." "The name," Min-jae said. "If I give them Baek Jun-seok, what does that change for me?" Oh Dae-jin looked at him. "It likely gets you to a civil penalty structure rather than criminal. Significant fines. Mandatory compliance oversight. Suspension of the subsidiary's government contract eligibility for 3 years," he paused. "But no prosecution." "And Baek?" "That's not our calculation to make." Min-jae looked at the conference table. He thought about a 63-year-old man with 30 years of service and 3 grandchildren. He thought about the specific moral calculus of a situation where protecting yourself required surrendering someone else. He had made that kind of calculation before, in the operational world, where the logic was brutal and clear. You protected what you could protect and accepted the cost of what you couldn't. He had always been able to make that calculation without it costing him anything he noticed. He noticed now. "Get back on the phone," Min-jae said. Oh Dae-jin stared at him. "What?" "I'm not giving his name to Han Ji-young before I give it to him directly," Min-jae said. "He deserves to know it's coming. He deserves to have time to get his own attorney." "Min-jae, that could be construed as witness tam." "I'm not telling him to run or to lie or to do anything except get a lawyer," Min-jae said. "Get him on the phone." Oh Dae-jin looked at him for a long, assessing moment. Then he picked up his phone. Baek Jun-seok answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was the voice of a man who had been waiting for a call he hoped would never come. "It's Min-jae," he said. "I need you to understand something. I'm in a meeting this morning that is going to reach your name. I cannot protect you from that, but I'm calling you before it happens to tell you to get an attorney today. Right now. Before this afternoon." A silence on the other end, long enough to hear Baek breathe. "I see," Baek said finally. His voice was very steady, very old. "Thank you for calling." Min-jae hung up. He sat for a moment. "Okay," he said to Oh Dae-jin. "Bring them back in." The rest of the meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Min-jae answered every question Han Ji-young put to him with a precision and completeness that he could see unsettling her professional composure, because it was not what she had prepared for. She had prepared for resistance, for managed disclosure, for the specific combat of a meeting where both sides understood that the truth was the last thing either party would produce without extraction. He produced it without extraction. He gave her Baek Jun-seok's name at the 90-minute mark. He gave her the full financial documentation by reference to the files Oh Dae-jin had prepared. He described the structure of the offshore accounts with the clarity of a man who had designed them and now wanted them documented for purposes he was only beginning to understand were more important than their original function. When it was over, Han Ji-young and her associate packed their materials and stood. "We will be in contact within 10 days, Han Ji-young said, with Commissioner Park's determination on the negotiated resolution framework." "We understand," Oh Dae-jin said. Han Ji-young looked at Min-jae one more time before she left. Something in her face had shifted over the 2.5 hours. Not warmth, but a kind of recalibrated assessment. The look of someone encountering a variable they hadn't factored. "Mr. Kang," she said. "Yes." "The level of cooperation you've provided today is unusual in our experience with matters of this kind." She paused. "Commissioner Park will take note of it." She left. Oh Dae-jin sat back in his chair when the door closed and exhaled through his nose. "I've known you for 14 years, he said. "I have never seen you do anything like that in a room." "I've never been in a room like that before," Min-jae said. You gave them everything. I gave them what they already had, Minjae said, and I gave them it cleanly, so they didn't need to dig for the rest. Odajin was quiet for a moment. The bait call, he said. That was a risk. I know. Why? Minjae looked at the empty conference table. At the surface of it, the grain of the wood, the same quality of surface he'd been looking at in every room for the past week and a half, while his world rearranged itself around a decision he was only now understanding he had already made. Because I'm done, he said, making decisions that I wouldn't want my son to know about. Odajin looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, picked up his files, and said nothing else. Minjae left the office at 11:23 and walked to his car and sat in the driver's seat and felt the full weight of the morning land on him. His hands were shaking slightly. Not dramatically, not visibly if you weren't looking, but a fine tremor in the fingers that came from adrenaline and inadequate sleep and the specific physical cost of sustained emotional exposure. He pressed his palms flat against his thighs and breathed. His phone buzzed. A message from Elijah Cross's office. Brief. Formal. The preliminary custody hearing has been scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. Your client's presence is required. Please confirm attendance with your legal representative. Friday. 2 days. He confirmed attendance. Then he sat in the car and thought about what Friday meant. Not in the legal sense. He had talked through the legal parameters with Odajin enough times to understand the framework. But in the sense that Friday was when everything he had set in motion over the past week and a half would arrive in a room together. Himself and Amara and the documentation and the attorneys and the accounting of everything that had happened between them, in front of a judge whose job was to look at two people and determine what was best for a child who had no vote in the matter. A child who was 8 months old and had his father's eyes, and who had already, in his 8 months of existence, been through more than most people managed in years. He drove back to the penthouse. He went to the nursery. He sat on the floor. He had been doing this, coming back to this room, sitting in this specific spot, with the frequency of a man returning to the site of something he needed to understand. There was nothing here to understand. The crib was empty. The room was exactly as Amara had left it, which was meticulously, which was her. Every surface clean, every object in its place, the careful order of a woman who had packed in darkness and still made sure nothing was left disorganized. Even leaving, she had been more attentive than he had been arriving. He sat there for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and opened the photo of Han Jae that Amara had sent him. Not the one from the contact entry, a newer one sent 3 days ago in a message that had contained no text, just the image. Han Jae on a blanket somewhere, looking directly at the camera with the expression of an 8-month-old who has not yet learned that there are situations in which direct eye contact is the wrong choice. Direct. Unguarded. Completely himself. Minjae had looked at that photo 17 times since receiving it. He looked at it again now. He thought about Friday, about walking into a courtroom and sitting across from Amara and the 2 legal teams, and the judge, who would determine what access he had to the person in the photograph. He thought about what Odajin had told him the framework would likely be. Supervised visitation initially, graduated toward unsupervised contingent on demonstrated stability, contingent on cooperation with the compliance process, contingent on a sustained period of, the attorney had used the phrase demonstrated behavioral change, which was attorney language for something simpler and harder, which was that Minjae had to prove, over time, through actions rather than arguments, that he was someone worth trusting with his son. He thought about what Amara had said in the meeting room in Mapogu. I am not going to raise our son to be afraid of the man who made him. He thought about Lee Dong-hyun and his 3-year-old daughter. He thought about Baek Jun-seok and his 30 years, and his 3 grandchildren and the phone call he had made this morning that was the first honest conversation he could remember having with someone he was about to hurt. He thought about Amara at 4 in the morning. He thought about Han Jae's weight in his arms for 90 seconds. He thought about who he needed to become between now and Friday, and the distance between that person and the person he had been last Tuesday, and the particular terror and necessity of that distance. His phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. Not the RM channel, not Cross's office. A number he didn't recognize. He opened it. Commissioner Park reviewed the meeting transcript this afternoon. His preliminary determination is favorable toward a negotiated resolution. But he wants one additional thing. Minjae read the message twice, then a second message from the same number. He wants your personal testimony at a closed session next week. Not your attorney speaking for you, in the room, answering questions directly. And then a third message, which arrived 10 seconds later, which was not from Commissioner Park's office at all, and which Minjae understood immediately was from someone who had been watching this entire process unfold from a position he couldn't see. You are doing the right thing. It won't feel like it until it's over, but you are. No signature. Minjae stared at the screen. He sat on the floor of the empty nursery with his phone in his hand, and his son's photograph on the screen and the weight of what was coming pressing down on him with the full accumulated force of everything that had brought him here. The empire, the affair, the empty crib, the black envelope, the 41 minutes on this same floor 11 days ago when he first understood that the person he had underestimated was the only person who had ever really known him. Friday was 2 days away. He had 2 days to become someone worth walking into that room as. He got up off the floor. He went to the kitchen and ate something for the first time in 14 hours. Not because he was hungry, but because he understood, with the clinical clarity of a man who has accepted the situation in front of him, that what was coming required him to be functional, and being functional required maintenance, and maintenance was now the most important discipline he had. He slept that night for 6 hours. Real sleep. The kind that comes when the body and the mind reach the same conclusion at the same time. That resistance is no longer the appropriate response to the situation at hand. He woke at 4:13 in the morning. He lay in the dark and thought about Amara being awake at 4. He picked up his phone. He did not call. He typed a message instead, short and without management in it, just the undecorated truth. I will be in that room Friday. I will not fight the agreement. I just need you to know that what you said in Mapo Gu about raising him not to be afraid of me. I heard it. I'm going to spend whatever time it takes proving it isn't something to be afraid of. I don't expect you to believe me yet. I just needed to say it. He set the phone down. He lay in the dark. 40 seconds later, his phone lit up. He picked it up. One line from Amara's number, sent at 4:14 in the morning from wherever she was, awake, like she had been awake at 4 for the past 11 days, carrying the weight of this the way she carried everything, carefully, completely, without letting it show until she was ready. I know you heard it. That's why I said it to you directly. Minjae held the phone in both hands and looked at those 11 words for a long time. Outside, the city was beginning its first gray approximation of morning. The Han River was out there somewhere, moving the way it always moved, steadily, without drama, carrying everything the city put into it toward something larger than itself. Friday was 48 hours away. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Kang Min-jae was not planning how to win. He was planning how to show up. Friday arrived the way difficult days always do. Ordinary on the outside, the city moving through its morning routines without any acknowledgement of what was happening inside a particular building on a particular street, the way cities always refuse to organize themselves around individual human catastrophe. Min-jae was awake at 3:47. He didn't check the time immediately. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the apartment being quiet around him. And then he reached for his phone and saw the numbers and thought about the fact that Amara had taken her pregnancy test at 3:47 in the morning in this same apartment, in the bathroom 15 feet from where he was lying, and that everything, all of it, every consequence and decision and loss and slowly assembling possibility of the past 11 months had begun in that specific moment. He got up. He showered. He shaved carefully, which he hadn't done properly in days, and looked at himself in the mirror for a moment with the unsentimental attention of a man taking inventory. He looked older than he remembered, not dramatically. He was 41, not ancient, but there was something different in his face that he couldn't attribute to any specific feature. Something that happened to faces when the thing they've been braced against finally arrives, and the bracing is no longer necessary. He put on a dark suit, not the kind he wore to intimidate. He had suits specifically calibrated for that purpose. Heavier fabrics, sharper lines, the visual grammar of authority. This was different, quieter. The kind of suit a man wears to a room where his character is going to be assessed, and he has decided that his only viable strategy is to show up as himself. He ate breakfast, made coffee, sat at the kitchen island where Amara used to sit alone in the mornings and drank the coffee slowly, and did not look at his phone. Odajin was in the lobby of the family court building when Min-jae arrived at 9:20. The attorney was in his own version of a careful suit, precise, professional, the suit of a man who had been in hundreds of these rooms and understood that the performance began in the parking lot. "How are you?" Odajin said. "Ready," Min-jae said. It was the honest answer. Odajin studied him for a moment. "I spoke with Cross last night, preliminary call, just to confirm the framework." He paused. "He said Amara slept 4 hours." Min-jae said nothing. "She's bringing Hanjae," Odajin said. "He'll be with Victoria Ellis in a waiting room during the proceedings. But she wanted him in the building." Min-jae understood that. He didn't know if he could have articulated why, but he understood it the way you understand things that are felt before they are thought. "Let's go in," he said. The courtroom was smaller than he expected. Family court had a different geometry than criminal court. Lower ceilings, less theatrical distance between the parties. The kind of architecture that said, this is a room for problems, not performances. The judge was a woman named Bae Hyun-suk, 60 years old, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the specific economy of movement of someone who has spent decades watching people perform their best versions of themselves in difficult circumstances and learn to look past the performance to the thing underneath. Amara was already seated at the plaintiff's table with Elijah Cross when Min-jae came in. He had not seen her in a formal legal context before. In the Mapogu meeting room, she had been present in the way of a person choosing to be there. The carrier, Hanjae's weight against her chest, the quiet authority of a woman on her own ground. Here she was different. Here she was formal, dark blazer, hair pulled back. The posture of someone who had prepared for this room the way Min-jae had prepared for operational briefings, completely, leaving nothing unaccounted for. She looked at him when he came in. He looked at her. Neither of them nodded or smiled or did any of the social things that people do when they see each other in difficult circumstances. They just looked for exactly 1 second, and in that second was the full compressed history of the morning, with the pregnancy test and the flowers he sent, and the night she ate alone, and the 11 days in the NICU, and the black envelope on the nursery floor. Then she looked back at the table in front of her. Min-jae sat down. Judge Bae called the session to order at 10:03. The proceedings moved with the specific rhythm of Korean family court, formal, methodical, the careful architecture of a system designed to make large human decisions in organized increments. Elijah Cross presented Amara's position first, the documentation, the timeline, the custody framework his office had prepared. He spoke in the measured, unhurried cadence of a man who had done this many times and understood that the most devastating arguments were the ones delivered without apparent effort. Min-jae listened to it all. He listened to the account of his absences during Hanjae's NICU stay, the dates, the hours, the specific nights when Amara had called and reached voicemail. He listened to the financial documentation presented as evidence of preparation to protect assets from divorce proceedings, which it had been, which he did not flinch from hearing described accurately. He listened to the characterization of his professional life and its intersection with his family life, which was not flattering and was not inaccurate. He listened without leaning forward to whisper objections to Oh Dae-jin, without writing notes on the legal pad in front of him, without doing any of the things a man does in a room like this, when his primary objective is to counter the narrative being constructed about him. He just listened. Oh Dae-jin, beside him, was the one who occasionally wrote notes, who occasionally leaned and murmured a question about strategy or framing. Min-jae answered the questions quietly and returned to listening. When Cross finished, Judge Bae looked at the defense table. Oh Dae-jin stood. He presented the framework of Min-jae's position, the cooperation with Park's office, the voluntary disclosure, the restructuring of the legitimate businesses, the documented steps toward what he called a substantial and sustained change in the client's professional and personal circumstances. He presented it well. Oh Dae-jin was a good attorney, and this was a well-prepared argument, and Min-jae heard it the way you hear something that is true, but not quite the truth. When Oh Dae-jin sat down, Judge Bae looked at her papers for a moment. Then she looked up. "Mr. Kang," she said, "I have a question for you directly." Oh Dae-jin put his hand briefly on Min-jae's forearm. Not restraining, just present, the gesture of a man indicating that he was available if needed. "Yes, Your Honor," Min-jae said. In the documentation presented by the plaintiff's counsel, Judge Bae said, there is a recorded message from your wife. I have reviewed it. In it, she describes a specific night, the fourth night of your son's NICU stay, when she called you 8 times over a period of 3 hours and did not receive a response. She looked at him over her reading glasses. Is that account accurate? The room was very quiet. Minji could feel the weight of the question. Not its legal weight, but its other weight. The human weight of a 60-year-old woman who had spent her career sitting in rooms like this one and asking exactly the question that cut through every prepared argument to the thing underneath. Yes, he said. It's accurate. Where were you that night? He felt Odejin go very still beside him. I was with someone who was not my wife, Min-jae said. I saw the calls. I didn't answer them. The room absorbed that. Judge Bae looked at him for a moment, not with judgment, or not primarily judgment, with the attention of a person receiving information they are going to use. I'm going to ask you one more question, she said, and I want you to understand that your answer to this question will have more weight in my determination than any document in this file. I understand, Min-jae said. Why should I believe, Judge Bae said, that the man who did not answer those calls is capable of becoming the father your son needs? The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The impact, then the spreading. Minji sat with it for a moment, not performing the sitting, actually looking at the question from the inside. I don't know that you should believe it, he said. I don't think I've earned that belief yet. I think the honest answer to your question is that I can't prove it to you in this room. I can only prove it over time, by showing up, by doing the specific things that I didn't do when I should have. He paused. What I can tell you is that my son's mother is one of the most honest people I have ever known, and she is not here to destroy me. She is here to protect him. And if she believes that I am capable of becoming that father, and she has given me some evidence that she does, then I think that is a more credible assessment of my potential than anything I could say about myself. He stopped. Judge Bae looked at him for a long moment over her glasses. Then she looked at Amara. Amara was looking at Min-jae. Her hands were flat on the table in front of her, very still, and her expression was not soft and was not hard. It was something else. The face of a woman who has heard something she was not entirely prepared to hear and is processing it with the full capability of a person who has always processed things completely. Judge Bae looked back at her papers. We will take a 30-minute recess, she said. The recess happened in separate rooms. Odejin walked Min-jae to a small waiting area down the hall and poured him water from a pitcher on a table and said nothing for almost 5 minutes, which was unusual for Odejin, who was not a man comfortable with silence. Finally, he said, "That was not what we prepared." "No," Min-jae said. "It was better," Odejin said. He said it simply, without embellishment, which was the most genuine thing Min-jae had heard him say in 14 years of professional relationship. Min-jae drank the water. He thought about Han-jae in a waiting room somewhere in this building with Victoria Ellis, who was probably very good at keeping 8-month-olds calm in unfamiliar spaces. He thought about his son not knowing that 40 meters away, his future was being organized by people who had opinions about it. He thought about the particular helplessness of being 8 months old in a world where every large decision was made by people who were, all of them, doing their imperfect best. They went back in. Judge Bae read her preliminary determination in the careful, sequential language of legal decisions. Each element addressed in order, each parameter defined, each condition stated with the precision of a document that would be referred back to over months and years. Min-jae listened to every word. The determination was this: Amara received primary physical custody of Han-jae with full legal custody joint between both parents. Min-jae received scheduled visitation, twice weekly, supervised by an approved third party, for a period of 4 months. At the 4-month review, if the supervisory reports were satisfactory and if Min-jae had maintained compliance with the conditions set by Park's office, supervision would be removed and visitation would expand to include overnights. The financial framework proposed by Cross's office was accepted in full, which meant Amara had the resources she needed to build her life independently of Min-jae's influence. There was one additional condition. The court is requiring, Judge Bae said, looking at Min-jae directly, that Mr. Kong participate in a structured parenting program to be completed within the first 6 months. not as punishment, as infrastructure. Because raising a child requires skills that success in other areas of life does not automatically confer. Min-jae nodded. Understood. I will need verbal confirmation for the record, Judge Bae said. I agree to all conditions, Min-jae said. Judge Bae looked at both of them, at Min-jae, then at Amara. I want to say something that is not part of the legal record, she said. I have been sitting in this court for 19 years. I have seen many parents in this room who have lost the ability to see their child as anything other than a position in an argument. She paused. Neither of you appears to have lost that. I'm going to hold you both to that standard going forward. Court is adjourned. She gathered her papers and left. The room was quiet for a moment in the specific way rooms are quiet when something large has just completed. Elijah Cross shook O'Dejin's hand across the table. Professional, brief, without theatricality. Min-jae and Amara were left facing each other across the space between the two tables, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Amara said, 5 minutes. Cross and O'Dejin both understood what that meant. They gathered their files and moved to the hallway. The door closed. Min-jae and Amara were alone in the courtroom. She didn't come to him, and he didn't go to her. They stayed where they were, 6 feet apart, which was the same distance as the morning with the pregnancy test, which was the same distance they had maintained since everything fell apart, which was, Min-jae thought, the right distance for now. Not forever, but for now. What you said to the judge, Amara said. Her voice was careful. Not fragile. Amara Bennett Kang had never been fragile in any room he'd seen her in, but careful the way you are careful with something that matters. I meant it, he said. I know you meant it, she said. That's not what I'm going to say. She paused. I'm going to say that I have watched you this past 2 weeks. What you did with Park's office, the call you made to Baek Jun-seok. She stopped. You know about the call, he said. Lee Dong-hyun told me, she said. He told Victoria. She told me. She looked at him steadily. You warned a man before turning him in. You didn't have to do that. No, he said. Why did you? He thought about Lee Dong-hyun's face in the operations room. I have a daughter. She's 3. He thought about what it meant to make decisions that your child could know about. Because I'm trying to figure out what kind of man I'm going to be, he said. And the kind of man I want to be would have made that call. Amara held his gaze for a moment. Hanjae is in the 3rd waiting room on the left, she said. Victoria has him. If you want to see him before you leave, she'll bring him out. Yes, he said. The word came out faster than intended, unmanaged, just the truth of what he wanted. Yes, I'd like that. Amara nodded. She picked up her bag from the chair. She walked toward the door, and he thought she was going to pass him without stopping, but she stopped. She was close enough that he could see the exhaustion in her face that the formal bearing had been keeping in check. The particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something enormous for a long time and has just set it down in a room and is feeling, for the first time, the full weight of what it was. I don't forgive you yet, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not going to say it does because it doesn't. I know, he said. But I'm not your enemy, she said. I was never trying to make you my enemy. I was trying to make sure you couldn't make me yours. I understand that now, he said. She looked at him for one more moment. He has your frown, she said. When he's trying to figure something out, he gets this... She stopped. Something moved in her face, something she hadn't planned to show, which was grief and love and exhaustion, all at once in the specific combination that comes from 2 people who have been through something together and cannot separate the damage from the meaning. He frowns exactly like you do. She walked out. Min-jae stood in the empty courtroom for a moment. Then he walked to the 3rd waiting room on the left. Victoria Ellis was sitting in a chair with Hanjae on her lap, and the baby was completely absorbed in a set of plastic rings that he was examining with the focused intensity of a scientist investigating a new material. He did not look up when the door opened. He turned one of the rings over in his hands with great concentration and said something that was not yet a word but had the cadence of one. Victoria looked up. Her expression was neutral and assessing and not unkind. I'll give you a few minutes, she said. She transferred Hanjae to the small mat on the floor, where he immediately reached for the rings again, and she stood and moved to the far corner of the room, close enough to see, far enough to allow. Min-jae crossed the room and sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. Not above his son's eye line. On the floor cross-legged, the way you have to sit to be at the right level for an 8-month-old who is not yet walking, and he put himself within Hanjae's peripheral vision and waited. Hanjae turned one of the rings over, turned it back, looked at it from a new angle. Then, with the casual omnidirectional attention of a baby who is not yet old enough to pretend he isn't looking at things, he looked up. He looked at Min-jae. Min-jae did not move, did not reach out, did not do any of the things adults do reflexively with babies, the reaching, the cooing, the performance of approachability. He just looked back. Hanjae stared at him for a moment with the dark eyes that were Min-jae's own eyes miniaturized, with the slight furrow of the brow that Amara said was pure Kang, with the mouth slightly open the way babies' mouths are when they are processing something new and have not yet decided what to do about it. Then Hanjae held out one of the plastic rings, just held it out, extended it in Min-jae's direction with the specific generosity of an 8-month-old who does not yet know that objects have ownership, who gives things because giving is what you do when you notice someone near you. Min-jae took the ring. He held it in his hand, this small, cheap plastic ring in the primary colors that babies' toys always are, and looked at it, and then looked at his son who was already reaching for the next ring in the set with total equanimity, moving on to the next investigation, and felt something happen in his chest that was not the breaking open of the week before, or the grief of the nursery floor, or the controlled pressure of the past 12 days. Something quieter than all of that. Something that had no adequate name in any language he had learned. He sat on the floor with his son for 11 minutes. Victoria Ellis watched from the corner. Hanjae handed him 2 more rings in the course of those 11 minutes, took one back, and at some point crawled approximately 14 inches to the left, for reasons that were unclear, and then sat back down and looked at the mat below him with the expression of a scientist who has just completed a field study. When Amara appeared in the doorway, Min-jae looked up. She looked at them. At her son on the mat, at Min-jae on the floor, at the plastic ring still in Min-jae's hand. Something in her face did the complicated thing it had been doing all day, the thing that was not forgiveness and was not indifference, but existed somewhere in the difficult territory between them. "We need to get going," she said quietly. Min-jae nodded. He set the ring on the mat in front of Hanjae. He stood up slowly, the way a man stands when he is reluctant to complete the motion. He looked at his son from standing height, the dark hair, the fat wrists, the absolute absorption in the rings, and said nothing because there was nothing to say to an 8-month-old that would be received as intended. He walked to the door. He passed Amara in the doorway, close enough that he was aware of the distance between them, and he stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the building, for letting him be in building today." She looked at him. "He's your son," she said. It was not a warm statement. It was a factual statement, said with the simplicity of something that does not require elaboration because it is simply true. He left. He walked down the hallway and out of the building into the late morning, which had become, without his noticing, warm. Not summer warm. It was October, and Seoul in October had its own specific quality of warmth, the warmth of a season in the act of leaving, golden and present and brief. He stood on the steps of the building for a moment and felt it on his face. Then he got in his car and drove. He drove for a long time. Not to the penthouse, not to the office in Mapogu, not to any of the locations that constituted his operational geography. He drove through the city without destination, through neighborhoods he knew and neighborhoods he didn't, across bridges over the Han River, through the quiet mid-morning streets of areas that had no connection to his professional life. He drove the way you drive when the objective is not arrival but motion, when what you need is the experience of moving through the world while your mind works on something that requires that kind of parallel processing. He thought about everything that had happened in the 11 months since the morning Amara came home with a pregnancy test and stood 6 feet away from him with hope on her face. He thought about it without defense, without the usual architecture of justification, the necessity arguments, the operational demands, the logic of a life built around control and its requirements. Just the facts of what had happened, laid out in sequence, as clearly as the 11 pages of notes he had written on the legal pad the night before the meeting with Park's office. He had loved his wife. He had also betrayed her. Both of those things were true at the same time, which was the most uncomfortable kind of truth, the kind that didn't resolve cleanly into a position you could defend or a verdict you could live with. He had wanted his son. He had also been absent for the most frightening period of his son's life. Both of those things were true. He had built something that had, in its own brutal way, required everything it required. There had been a version of the logic that was real, that had made sense when he was 26 and the world was arranged differently. And he had also, at some point, confused the requirements of the machine he'd built with the requirements of his own character, and stopped being able to tell which was which, and used the machine's needs as permission for choices that were simply his. That was the thing he hadn't been able to see from inside it. He could see it now. He pulled over on a bridge over the Han River, got out of the car, leaned on the railing and looked at the water. October light on the Han was flat and gold and wide, the river moving with the indifferent steadiness that rivers have, carrying the city's weight without comment. He stood there for a while. Then he took out his phone and called Ryu. "It's done," he said. "How did it go?" Ryu said. "The way it needed to go," Min-jae said. "Listen, the transition plan we discussed, I want to move on it formally, starting next week. I'll be stepping back from all operational involvement. I'll communicate with the senior council by the end of the week." "Understood," Ryu said. After a pause, he added something that Min-jae did not expect from Ryu, who was not a man who typically offered personal observations. "Min-jae, for what it's worth, I've been with you 11 years. I've watched you make a lot of decisions. This one," he stopped. "This one is the right one." Min-jae looked at the river. "I know," he said. He hung up. He stood on the bridge a while longer. He thought about the first supervised visit, which would happen within the next 2 weeks according to the schedule Cross and Odaijin would finalize. He thought about sitting on a floor again, this time in whatever designated space the agreement specified, waiting to see whether Han-jae would hand him something. He thought about 4 months of that, then overnights. Then, if he did what he needed to do, consistently, without relapse into the patterns of the man he had been. More than that. More than that. He drove back to the penthouse. He went to the nursery. He stood in the doorway this time, rather than going in. He looked at the room from the threshold, the walnut crib he had chosen because he wanted his son to have something solid, the careful order Amara had maintained even in her leaving, the quality of light in the room in the late morning, which was good light. Someone had chosen that apartment partly for the light in the nursery. He had not done that. Amara had done that. He thought about everything she had carried and planned and built while he was looking elsewhere, and he did not feel, standing in the doorway, the version of himself that had sat on the floor of this room 11 days ago in paralysis and shock. He felt something different. Not resolution. Resolution was too neat a word for what he was standing at the beginning of. But orientation. The specific feeling of a man who has found the direction he needs to move in and accepted the distance between where he is and where that takes him. He had a long way to go. He understood that. He left the nursery doorway and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the island. He picked up a legal pad, a fresh one, not the accounting, something else, and wrote one sentence at the top of the first page. "What does Han-jae need from me in the next year?" He sat with that sentence for a while. Then he started writing. The weeks that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a life under reconstruction. Not dramatic, not linear, containing both forward motion and the specific setbacks of a process that doesn't respect the schedule you impose on it. Min-jae learned this the way he had to learn most things now, by experiencing it rather than by managing it. The first supervised visit happened 17 days after the Friday hearing. A neutral space, a family center in Yongsan that specialized in these arrangements, clean and thoughtfully designed for exactly this purpose, with toys and floor mats and the kind of careful, ordinary light that communicated safety. The supervisor was a woman named Kim So-young, who was professionally warm without being cloying, and who spent the first 10 minutes observing from across the room before finding something in another corner that suddenly required her complete attention, which was the specific professional courtesy of someone who knew that some things go better with less observation. Han-jae did not immediately recognize Min-jae. That was the thing he had not fully prepared for, even though Odaijin had told him to expect it, even though he had read about it in the materials the parenting program coordinator had given him in their first session. Knowing something cognitively and experiencing it physically were two separate events. He walked into that family center, and Han-jae looked at him the way Han-jae looked at any new element in his environment, with a baby's categorical curiosity, unweighted by relationship, uninfluenced by what Min Jae needed the recognition to mean. He sat on the floor. He did not reach out. He waited. After approximately 6 minutes, Han Jae crawled toward him, not dramatically, not with any indication that something significant was happening. He crawled toward Min Jae with the purposeful directness of an 8-month-old who has identified a new terrain worth investigating, and he arrived at Min Jae's knee, and he put his hand on it, and he looked up. Min Jae looked down. The frown was there, the brow furrowed slightly over the dark eyes in the expression Amara had described, the working-it-out expression, pure Kong. Min Jae felt something move through his face in response that he didn't try to manage, and Han Jae watched it with the focused attention of a baby, learning to read a new face. Then Han Jae patted his knee twice with an open hand, seemingly satisfied with his investigation, and turned and crawled toward a set of stacking cups near the center of the mat. Min Jae sat on the floor and watched his son stack cups with the diligence of a person who takes stacking cups seriously, and felt the specific quality of that moment, unremarkable, domestic, completely without the drama that the past year had accustomed him to, and understood that this was it. This was the work. Not the courtroom, and not the negotiations, and not the moment of decision on the bridge over the Han River. This, the floor, the cups, the slow, incremental construction of presence in a small person's awareness. He showed up every visit, every scheduled call, every commitment made to the framework, to Park's office, to the parenting program, to the slow process of restructuring his professional life into something his son could know about. He showed up with the discipline of a man who understood that this was the most important operational objective he had ever had, and with something underneath the discipline that was not discipline at all, but something less structured and more essential, something that had been trying to surface in him for a long time and had finally found its way through. The 4-month review came. Kim So-young's supervisory reports were, according to Oh Dae-jin, who had reviewed them before the review meeting, consistently positive. Not gushingly so, not in the way that signals a report designed to please, but in the measured and specific way of a professional recording observable behavior over time. He showed up. He was present. He followed Han Jae's lead rather than imposing a version of the visit onto the child. He handled frustration, his son's occasional crying, the ordinary difficulty of a baby's communication limitations, without withdrawal. He showed up. At the review meeting, which was smaller than the Friday hearing, with only Oh Dae-jin and Cross present as legal representatives and Judge Bae presiding, Amara sat across the table again. She looked different from the Friday hearing, less formal or differently formal. The armor of that day had been appropriate to the stakes of that day, and these stakes, while real, were different. She looked like herself in a way she hadn't been able to look in the courtroom. She looked like the woman who had stood in the living room with a pregnancy test, not the same. Nothing about her was exactly the same as before, and he didn't expect it to be and didn't want it to be, because the woman she was now was someone who had survived something and chosen something difficult and come through it still capable of sitting in a room with him without anything toxic between them. Judge Bae reviewed the reports, asked a few questions, looked at both of them over her reading glasses the way she had on the Friday, with the same quiet authority. "The supervision condition is lifted," she said. "Visitation expands to the schedule detailed in the amended agreement. Overnights begin at the 6-month mark, provided there are no material changes in circumstances." She set down her papers. "Is there anything either party wants to raise before we close?" Cross looked at Amara. Amara looked at Min Jae. "No," she said. "No," Min Jae said. Judge Bae nodded. "Then we're done. For today." They walked out of the building together. Not side by side, not with any deliberate coordination, just two people who happened to exit through the same door at the same time because they had been in the same room for the same reason. On the steps, they stopped. The day was February, cold and clear, the kind of soul winter day that was brittle and bright, the kind of cold that you feel in your face before you feel it anywhere else. "He said something last week," Amara said. Min Jae looked at her. "Not a real word yet," she said, "but close. It starts with a D." She paused. "He says it a lot. I can't figure out yet if it's directed at anything specific or just a sound he likes." Another pause, smaller. "I thought you should know." Min Jae looked at his wife, his estranged wife, the woman he had married and failed and who had, in failing him back in the only direction that mattered, given him the possibility of becoming someone worth the trouble, and felt the distance between them with great precision. 6 feet again, always 6 feet, for now. The right distance. "Thank you for telling me," he said. She nodded. She started down the steps. "Amara," he said. She stopped, looked back. "I know this isn't—" He stopped, started again, because he had promised himself, after everything, not to manage his words with her anymore. "I know there's no version of this where I get back what I had. I understand that." He held her gaze. "I'm not trying to get it back. I'm trying to earn something different, something that's actually worth having." She looked at him for a long moment in the February cold. "I know," she said. Not warmly, not with promise, but with the specific quality of truth. The recognition of a woman who has watched a man carefully for a long time and is reporting what she has observed. "I can see that you are." She walked down the steps and got into a waiting car and drove away. Min-jae stood on the steps in the cold for a moment. Then he walked to his car. 6 months later, 8 months after the Friday hearing, October again, the same quality of gold light on the Han River, Min-jae was standing in the kitchen of a smaller apartment in Mapogu that he had taken after the penthouse was sold as part of the financial restructuring. Smaller than the penthouse. Quieter. A kitchen with a window that looked onto a courtyard where a ginkgo tree was losing its leaves in the October way. Not all at once, but steadily, over days, each leaf making its individual decision. Hanjae was on the kitchen floor. He was 14 months old now and had been walking for 6 weeks, with the specific determined wobble of a child who has recently discovered that upright locomotion is possible and has committed to it fully, regardless of the fall rate. He was walking toward the cabinet under the sink with the focused intention of a person who has identified a specific objective. "Hanjae," Min-jae said. And Hanjae looked up at him. He said, clearly, with the directness of a child who has learned that sound makes things happen. "Da." Not dad, not dada, just da, but directed at him, with eye contact, in the specific way that language begins. Not as a label, not as a name, but as a recognition. "You. I see you. You are a category of person in my world." Min-jae crouched down to his son's level. He thought about the morning with the pregnancy test. He thought about the empty nursery. He thought about 11 pages on a legal pad and a bridge over the Han River, and a plastic ring handed from small hands to large ones, and the sound of a baby breathing in a quiet room in Mapogu. He thought about what it had cost, what it had taken, what it had required of him and of Amara, and of everyone who had moved through the year between that morning and this kitchen floor. He thought about the fact that none of it had been easy, and none of it had been clean, and none of the people involved had gotten away without damage, and that the damage was real, and the losses were real, and the distance that still existed between himself and Amara was real and would take time he didn't know how to measure. And also, his son was on the kitchen floor saying "da." Both things were true. That was the only resolution that was available. Not the clean resolution, not the complete one, but the honest one. The two things existing at the same time, neither canceling the other, the damage and the possibility living in the same kitchen in the same October light. Min-jae sat down on the floor. Hanjae, satisfied that he had been acknowledged, turned back toward the cabinet. "No," Min-jae said, with the calm and firmness of a man who had been learning, slowly, the specific vocabulary of parenthood. Not the grand version, not the cinematic version, but the actual version, which was mostly this: showing up, redirecting, being present for the small things, doing it again tomorrow. Hanjae stopped, looked back at his father, considered. Then he changed direction, veering toward the mat where his toys were, already absorbed in the next investigation, already moving on with the complete forward momentum of a person who has not yet learned to carry the past with him. Min-jae watched him. His phone buzzed on the counter. A message from Amara. No text, just a video, 12 seconds long, taken earlier that day. Hanjae walking across a room he didn't recognize, Amara's place, arms out for balance, frowning at the floor in concentration. He crossed the whole room and arrived at the far wall and put both hands flat against it and looked back at the camera, proud, completely, unguardedly proud of himself. Min-jae watched it twice, then he typed back, "He did that with me too last night. He walked to the refrigerator and then looked at me like he expected applause. 3 seconds. Then, he gets that from you. He sat on the kitchen floor and looked at that message and almost smiled. Not yet forgiven, not yet whole, not anything that could be called repaired, because some things don't repair. They scar, and the scar becomes part of the structure. And if you are very careful and very honest and you do the work, the structure holds. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at his son investigating a set of blocks on the mat. Outside, the ginkgo tree in the courtyard was losing its leaves in the October way. The light was the same light that had been on the river that day in February on the bridge. It moved across the kitchen floor in the unhurried way of afternoon light, landing on his son's dark hair, catching the specific expression of concentration on his face. Kang Min-jae had spent 20 years believing that power was the ability to control what happened. He understood now that it was something smaller and harder and more worth having. The ability to show up for what happened, unchanged by it, present in it, not running it, but inside it. His son picked up a block, examined it, handed it back over his shoulder in Min-jae's direction without looking. Min-jae took it. He held it in his hand, small, wooden, primary red, and looked at his son's back and felt the full weight and the full lightness of the moment, both at once, the way the real moments always are. The ginkgo tree kept losing its leaves. The afternoon kept moving. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Kang Min-jae was not watching the clock.